Greetings. My name is Matthew Bowen and I'm a clinical psychologist with a practice focused on combat veterans. 5 years ago I founded the Combat Veterans Oral History Project and used it as a basis for establishing a university class entitled The Combat Experience. Through the project, I've been an oral historian with American combat veterans, Pearl Harbor through the present. I've done approximately 36 in-depth interviews equally distributed among World War II, Vietnam, and Middle East War veterans, and including a couple of Korea, to me not the forgotten war. I've learned some fundamental things that have come to apply in my practice with Vietnam and Middle Eastern War veterans, and I call it the Middle East War versus OIF, but I'm talking of course about Iraq and Afghanistan, and Desert Storm as the case may be. World War II veterans were able to be proud of their service, have resolution and clarity of their mission. The reason being it's the last war where we had a declared war that was fought with traditional rules of engagement against a clear enemy, also professional soldiers in uniform, with civilians largely out of the way, but clearly civilians, not insurgents. The World War II veteran had clear rules of engagement, and the goal was to take territory. They had the support to the nth degree of their own country, and they could trust their government and their high command. They had a victory that was clear because the enemy surrendered. Beyond World War II, things changed not for the better for the American combat soldier and Marine. Korea was some indication of that. Although it was a frontline war and civilians were largely out of the way, the war was never won. As a result, today, 60+ years later, North Korea is still an active enemy and the DMZ is still a hotspot. With Vietnam, we saw where we were going ultimately with the Middle East War as well. The mission became very ambiguous soon after being undertaken. As the war dragged on, the fighting troops lost the support of their country. They lost the ability to trust the motives and operations not only of their government, but of their high command as well. It was the war where the notion by the government of winning the hearts and minds of the civilian population was first introduced. Therefore, the mission became not to defeat the enemy and take territory, but to somehow emerge victorious by taking the hearts and minds of a civilian population that didn't want them there. Then as the war dragged on, the next major imposition to the functioning of the combat troops was the notion of rules of engagement. By the government, filtered through the high command, the fighting troops were then told how, when, and where to fight, increasingly against their own sense of how to win and how to survive. This lent to a great sense of betrayal. It lent to a sense of anger and bitterness and frustration and fear and undue loss upon undue loss. The Vietnam veteran has told me that what it began to boil down to was the only way that they could make sense of their deployment and their combat experience was to rely solely on trying to keep the man next to them alive and for that man to keep them alive, to get through it together. Their loyalty, their sense of the whole reality boiled down to their squad. That's all they could believe in and count on. All the negatives for the combat troops in the Vietnam War were ultimately even worse as the Middle East War then ground on. You had more imposition of rules of engagement, an increased notion of hearts and minds being your operational strategy versus using your own instincts and experience, as said, to kill the enemy and survive. The enemy was the civilian population whose hearts and minds you were supposed to be winning. Thus the term insurgency. Those that were supposedly helping you during the day or night were in fact, as often as not, cooperating with the enemy and were the enemy themselves, to wire IEDs to destroy you and were sniping on you night and day. The civilians were entirely in the way. Who the enemy was now not clear. Again now, you had our combat troops, Army and Marines, feeling entirely betrayed, entirely made to feel vulnerable, frustrated, bitter, resentful, unsupported by their government, to a large extent by their own high command, and certainly by their own country. And so once again, as with Vietnam veterans, our Middle East War veterans' war was boiled down to relying on their immediate squad. The only thing that could make sense to them, as described with Vietnam, was to take care of their brothers. And in this war, with female combat veterans, sisters now as well. The multiple deployments took a great toll on the fighting troops and their significant others and their families. Vietnam had a very determined time for deployment, 11, 12, 13 months. In World War II, you fought till it was over. Now we had multiple deployments of many months. You had to come back to the States, try to function somehow within the United States structure, knowing you were going back, knowing what you were going back to. It was worse upon worse with each deployment. And now National Guard troops were thrown into the mix completely on the terms of a fighting force as well, and they weren't prepared going in or coming back. And so in my practice, the focus is on trying to gradually help these troops, these combat veterans, come to terms with the moral conflicts that they were continually confronted with because of the way the war was imposed upon them, because of the circumstances of the war. Not at all like World War II, as I've described. How can they be proud? How can they rely on their country, their government, or even their high command under those circumstances? And then once back stateside, by and large, they're separated from their beloved squad, the ones that they survived with, the ones that they could only count on and make sense of. Worse yet, trying to make sense of and reconcile the losses of their squad, of their comrades in arms. Because more often than not, they feel those losses were unnecessary because of the nature of the war imposed upon them. So the focus on this practice is to try to draw from the lessons Pearl Harbor through Helmand Province. I often refer to the words of wisdom of World War II veterans and Vietnam veterans who have reconciled their service, reconciled their experience, and use those to help Middle East War veterans realize that eventually they can hopefully arrive at that same sense of reconciliation as well. And that's my goal.
The ridiculousness of anything I've just told you, while the sounds and the smells and the tension of all of these zillion men trying to destroy each other, pretty silly now.